Welcome to our third week, and this week we're going to change gears. Last week we were focused more on practical moral reasoning, and we placed that under the umbrella term consequentialism. But largely it's practical in the sense that we focus on the consequences of actions. What really happened? Who was really harmed? Who was really benefited by an action? This week, we're going to take an entirely different look. We're going to take a look at deontology, and ethics will look very different from this perspective. Instead of practical moral reasoning, deontology is really more of a principled moral reasoning. From the perspective of deontology, the most important consideration when determining the morality of any case is evaluating the real or anticipated duties or principles that apply and determining if actors are conforming their behavior to these duties or principles. Now remember, last week when I first introduced consequentialism, I said that the mode of reasoning, the analogy that I used, was like comparison shopping. But instead of shopping for things, we're shopping for different options or alternatives. And if we have 5 alternatives, we're seeking the best alternative, the one that will produce the best consequences, just like we do when we're comparison shopping. Deontology, the analogy for the mode of reasoning here, is that it's deductive, and therefore it's more like a job description. It's like a job description in the sense that it tells us what the principles are, what the ideals are, and that we as an employee or a potential employee have to somehow live up to or achieve those standards. So principled moral reasoning really gives us ethical standards against which we evaluate our own behavior and the behavior of others. There are a number of, just like there were a number of different versions of consequentialism, there are a number of versions of deontology. Legal systems, for instance, are a type of deontology. The belief that a community or society has the right to impose certain restrictions on behavior for the public good. And it sets a number of principles up so that people within society know the limits that they can go to in regards to their behavior. Another example of deontology is Kant's categorical imperative, and we'll be talking more about Kant's categorical imperative in this lecture. It's a belief system that is an extension of intrinsic-extrinsic value theory, focusing on whether one could universalize the maxim of an action. And because we're going to talk about this more later, I'm not going to get into it in great detail right here and now. Another kind of deontology is known as the natural law. And the natural law is the belief that there is a moral order built into the structure of nature or the universe. Just like, for instance, the physical sciences believe that there is a physical order built into the way the universe functions, which is why we have formulas for things like gravity. Physicists believe that gravity is a force that's built into the nature of the way in which the universe functions. The natural law believes the moral order is also something that's been built into the natural order of things, whether that's built into our genetic structure, whether it's built into the way human society functions. There are a number of different ways in which natural law ethicists come at this problem or come at this perspective, but nevertheless, it's the belief that the moral order is built into the way things are. It isn't something we just made up. And in fact, Kant believes, for instance, that what he discovered was something that was really built into the nature of the way in which the universe functioned. So for natural lawyers, right and wrong are fixed and given by the very order that created and sustained the universe. Again, it's not something we made up. It's not something that was developed out of human culture. It's something built into the way the world has been created by some kind of creator, or it doesn't have to be religious. Although Kant was a religious person and many natural lawyers are, the truth is you can be a secularist natural lawyer. Another kind of deontology is divine command, the belief that it is our duty to obey the laws and commandments of a divine being. And so what would fall under this would be something like the Ten Commandments. God's told us to do it, we should do it because God wants us to do it. Not because it's the right thing to do, not because it's something that will achieve the common good, not because it's something that even is built into the way in which the world functions. We do it only because God said do it. And we know God said do it because here it's in our scripture, or a prophet told us and the prophet is always speaking to God, or something of this nature. Of course, we have many examples of this kind of divine command morality in our world today. Many religious communities function, or at least they claim they function, by divine command. Another kind of deontology is this, what's sometimes referred to as relational responsibility. It's the belief that membership in a certain community, like being Catholic or being Jewish or being a certain kind of Muslim, or being a certain kind of Hindu, or being in a certain relationship, so for instance, being part of the Debal community, mandates a specific moral response to ethical dilemmas. So because I am a Catholic, I have a certain relationship with other Catholics, or a certain relationship with the world in which I live, and therefore I must behave in this way. Or because I am a Buddhist, I have a certain relationship with other people and the entire universe, and therefore I must behave in a certain way because of the relationships I have established with other people, primarily, but also, we could say, with a divine being or with all of creation. Finally, deontology, the human dignity and intrinsic value theory is a part of deontology. The belief that persons have value in and of themselves, while things, objects, have value for the sake of something or someone else. And we'll get into that in greater detail. It's just the belief that people have value even if we are not per se useful to someone else, that we have value in and of ourselves, that we have value because we are human, because of who we are, rather than because of what we are doing for or contributing to other people. Whereas things in our world, objects, tend to only have value insofar as others or something else values them. So a chair has value only insofar as someone else values that chair. And some ethical systems will require us never to treat human beings as objects like we would treat a chair, but always as subjects, as beings with value in and of themselves. Human dignity and intrinsic extrinsic value is what we'll talk about next, which is what we were just talking about a minute ago. It answers the question of why moralists normally treat human beings differently from all other beings on the moral landscape. It's grounded in the notion that human beings are morally exceptional. That we are not like cats or dogs or birds or bees or trees or rocks or anything else in the moral landscape. Human beings are unique. And human beings are unique because we have moral value simply by virtue of our humanity, and not due to the fact that we serve some kind of purpose for someone or something else. And this is the basic theory that undergirds most Western legal, political, and moral traditions. The idea that human beings are morally exceptional is something that is functional in our society if we have relationships with our legal system. If you go into a court, at some point, often right off the bat, but if you were to sit there for a number of hours, you would eventually hear, basic ideas of human dignity and the intrinsic value of the human person come up in different cases. The concept of human rights is grounded in this notion, and so, for instance, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which lists 36 or more rights of the human person, is something that highlights this idea that human beings are exceptional. They are a creature that is very different than other creatures or other things in our moral landscape. Contemporary ecocentric environmental ethics challenge the idea that human beings occupy a unique and privileged place in the moral landscape. So one of the movements within morality itself, this movement of ecocentric environmental ethic, is beginning to challenge the idea that human beings have intrinsic value, or a value that is uniquely different from all other living creatures on the planet. In many ways, the environmental ethic tends to level the playing field, tends to say, well, it's because we have treated ourselves as exceptional that we are running into all of the environmental, ecological crises that we are running into. Because we think of ourselves as exceptional, we feel free to pollute. Because we think of ourselves as exceptional, we feel free to destroy and to undermine our ecological world. Kant's categorical imperative is the last thing we're going to cover today. And this is a very important theory, and it's certainly a theory that's very popular. It has been very popular since its definition back in the 18th century. Immanuel Kant was the one who originally came up with this theory. Like utilitarianism, this is a post-Enlightenment attempt by philosophers to make ethics more scientific. While utilitarians were looking at morality from the perspective of experimental science, Kant took a different tack and looked at morality from the perspective of theoretical science. So utilitarianism takes this inductive approach of experimental science, while Kant takes the deductive approach of theoretical science. Its first formulation, and there are 3 formulations of Kant's categorical imperative, is that we should act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That is, whenever I am going to act in a situation where there are moral issues, I can only choose an option that I could acceptably universalize, in the sense that I could accept anyone, anywhere, doing what I am about to do, even if that person was doing that to me. So it's this idea of universalizability. Can I universalize what I am about to do? The second formulation, and some students immediately ask, why is there more than one formulation? Well, it turned out that Kant makes the first formulation and gets it out there, and a lot of moralists respond very positively. But a number of moralists come to realize that in practice this is kind of difficult to apply. In a number of cases it's almost impossible to identify a maxim of the action and then to think about, well, what would universalizing this mean? So Kant came up with a second formulation, one that's kind of a shorthand for the categorical imperative. And the second formulation is act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means to an end. And this is something we were talking about earlier. We used terms like subject and object. Always treat human persons as having, here he uses this end in themselves, but always treat human beings as though they have intrinsic value in and of themselves, and never merely as a means to an end, never merely as an object. Always treat them as a subject, never as an object. It is kind of an easier way of saying it. And he uses this term merely, never merely as a means to an end. And I like to highlight that, because if that word is taken out, the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative is patently false. Because every day, most of us get used as a means to an end. And in fact, right now, teaching this class, DePaul University is using me as a means to an end. I'm an employee of DePaul University. If I didn't teach for them, and if I didn't perform other duties that are part of my requirements as a professor here at DePaul, they would fire me. They would let me go. I would not have, that kind of external objective value to them. However, I don't think they're using me merely as a means to an end, because they're paying me a really good salary, or at least a salary that DePaul University and I have agreed is a good salary, and they've given me a lot of benefits, and I believe this is a give and take, and they are treating me also as an end unto myself. So the truth is that word merely is there for a very good reason, and that's because we frequently use each other as a means to an end. The problem comes in when we treat people as only a means to an end. So an obvious example of that would be, for instance, slavery. Slavery is would never be acceptable under Kant's categorical imperative, and of course it wouldn't be acceptable under many ethical systems, but it's obviously not acceptable under Kant's categorical imperative, because clearly we're just using the slave as a means to an end and not treating them as an end unto themselves. The third formulation is rarely used, and often in textbooks it's not even mentioned. Nevertheless, I like to mention it here. It's often called the kingdom of ends. So that's the title put on this third formulation. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. By the way, all of these definitions of the first, second, and third formulation are quotes from Kant himself. What the third formulation is doing is it's asking us in a lot of ways to engage in a thought experiment. There are actually other ethical systems that ask us to do this, and we'll be covering those in the future. But it's a thought experiment where Kant says, imagine yourself in a world where everyone treats everyone else perfectly as an end unto themselves. This is a perfectly moral universe that we have been transported into magically. Now, is the thing you are about to do, would that option fit within that world, or would we in so many ways be humiliated or embarrassed to behave that way in front of all these morally perfect people in this morally perfect world? So it's a kind of thought experiment. In a morally perfect universe, in this kingdom of ends, would our alternative actually fit, or would it be out of place? Kant gave us a number of case studies, for instance, suicide, and he applies the first, second, and third formulation to these cases. And of course, he comes out against suicide. He comes out against defaulting on a loan, and of course, against idleness or laziness. and avoiding the less fortunate. That Kant would say, no, we're not supposed to cross the street to get away from the person who's, asking us for change to get on the train or something of this nature. We can't avoid the less fortunate.